Dear viewers, welcome to our Tea Time program. Before we start, let's take 2 minutes, as we do every week, and give you a progress report on the world champion, Erden Eruç, rowing solo in the middle of the Pacific as we speak. Erden holds 15 Guinness World Records and is just on the way to a few more. He left California 72 days ago, rowed 2,300 miles, now is near Hawaii. After Hawaii, he is rowing solo to Hong Kong, which is approximately 5,600 miles more. That is traveling with oars only, no motors, no emissions, no carbon footprint. Our hearts and minds are with Erden, and we'll keep you updated every week. Today we have a very special guest, I should say a man of all seasons, Dr. Allan Gall, a man successful and talented in so many ways. Dr. Gall lived in Turkey for a total of 8 years as a Peace Corps English teacher in the Çankırı Ortaokulu ve Lisesi, as a grants administrator for the Ford Foundation, and a Fulbright Hays Research Fellow. He has a Ph.D. in Near East Studies from the University of Michigan, and his dissertation examined the themes of Aziz Nesin's prodigious literary output and his social and political satire. Dr. Gall was the Peace Corps country director for 3 years in the Yemen Arab Republic, regional chief of operations for the Peace Corps in Washington, D.C., and chief of program evaluation and chief of operations for the Federal Office of Refugee Settlement, refugee program specialist on the Congressional Commission on Immigration Reform, director of state funding coordination for the Department of Agriculture, and deputy and inspector general at the Peace Corps for the overall operation. In this very intense career path, Dr. Gall found the time to write 2 excellent books: To Save an Empire, a historical novel about the Ottoman Empire, and Of Mouse and Magic, a delightful children's book. With all his diverse experiences, we will not be surprised to see more books coming. We thank Dr. Gall very much for taking the time to be with us on TASCTV today. And I would like also to thank our technical expert, Bülent Büyükyazıcı, for supporting us all the way from Turkey. The podium is yours, Dr. Gall. So before I'll start with a question. How did you get involved in Peace Corps? Tell us a little more about it. What is it, and how did it work in Turkey, and what motivated you?
Well, the Peace Corps started in 1961, just toward the end of 1961, and I joined in the spring of 1962. I heard about the Peace Corps because they were recruiting through student newspapers at all the universities and colleges across the United States. And I had actually graduated already, and I was teaching high school English, but I heard about it, and my initial reaction was, well, I don't think I want to do that, because I had a scholarship for the next year to go to graduate school. But after just thinking about it for 2 or 3 days, I thought, well, what an exciting opportunity. I mean, I've lived my entire life in rural South Dakota, and they're offering to send me to some country somewhere in the world. And I thought, wow, that would be a fantastic learning experience. Now, I know that, some people think we volunteered out of altruistic feeling to help people. Well, there was a little bit of that. Of course, I hoped I would be useful, but mostly I have to admit I did it because I thought, wow, what a fantastic opportunity for me to learn something about the world, and hopefully I can do a little good at the same time.
Well, how did you choose Turkey? I mean, was it a lottery that your country is picked like that?
Well, the Peace Corps, of course, was a bureaucracy, and like all bureaucracies, sometimes things aren't very logical. What I was reluctant about with the Peace Corps was that I had this rural background. I had grown up on a farm in South Dakota, and my fear was, well, if I volunteer for the Peace Corps, they're going to send me to some place like India to try to teach farming. And I wasn't, my reaction was, well, I know how to farm in South Dakota, but I will know much less about how to farm in India than the poorest of the farmers there. So I don't want to be sent there as an agricultural expert. But I applied, and fortunately, because it's a bureaucracy, all they wanted was people who were qualified for the positions that they were filling on that particular day. And on that particular day, they were filling positions for English teachers in Turkey, and I was an English teacher, and so that's where they sent me.
It's amazing. So you really didn't have your interest in Middle East. Was it there before, when you were growing up in this lovely state up in the north west, I guess, a little bit? Was there any interest there to Middle East, or did it come after Turkey?
No, I have to confess that I had no interest in the Middle East. I actually was hoping to be sent to South America or the Central America because I thought learning Spanish would be really useful. And, you know, everybody knew about India and places like that. But I mean, I knew a little bit about Turkey, but I never would have thought, well, that's the place I want to go. But as soon as they sent me there, you know, I started reading and I thought, wow, this is actually going to be a really interesting place to go. I'm so glad they're sending me there.
It's fascinating. So the Peace Corps is still on, and is it all over the world, or is it a certain number of countries that are involved?
At this particular moment, the Peace Corps is inactive because with the pandemic, they closed all of the operations and brought all the volunteers home, and they put all the staff on sort of, actually, I don't know exactly what the status of the staff is. I think they have kept the staff on overseas, the local staff, and staff here have been doing some work, virtually, but basically they've been shut down for almost 2 years now. And the question is, will they be able to go back to many of these same countries, given the fact that the vaccine is not widespread at all. In fact, it's barely spread, even minimally, in most of these countries where the Peace Corps was. I think it's not going to be possible for volunteers to go back there in the immediate future, in any case.
So the Peace Corps was really aimed at the developing countries. So you didn't have anybody in Europe, did you?
Well, actually, at one time, I forget for how many years, but starting in the, I think, late 70s, maybe, or maybe it was the mid 80s. I can't remember exactly. They were even in Russia. The Peace Corps had offices in Russia, and both in Eastern Russia and in Moscow, and they had volunteers teaching English and doing small business development things in Russia. And they also had them in Poland and in Czechoslovakia and in most of Eastern Europe.
Well, always I thought it was an excellent program. I mean, there is nothing better person-to-person relationship to improve the whole relations between countries. So once you know somebody well, you can't really get too angry with the country or you can't curse and cuss. I know from my Greek friends, I get very annoyed at what's going on politically, but we have a wonderful soprano who's from southern Cyprus and married to a northern Cyprus Turk. And she sings the Turkish national anthem like from the heart. So how can you get mad at this southern Cyprus? Anyway, it was a very, I always had the best impressions, and I know in Washington you carried the Turkey group, the group that went to Turkey, very nice events, Republic Day dinners and such. And then we had people like Heath Lowry, he turned out to be a spectacular scholar, and he's still doing good things. Next week we are going to cover some of his work with a movie maker. Anyway, so after you were there with Fulbright, what did you study in Turkey? You were a Fulbright recipient while you were in Ankara, in Turkey, weren't you?
Yes. After I did my graduate work at the University of Michigan, I got this Fulbright Hayes Scholarship to go to Turkey to do research. My interest was in contemporary Turkish literature, and one of the obvious writers that interested me was Aziz Nesin. But I didn't know whether he would be receptive or what. So literally on the second or third day that I was in the country, I found an apartment to live in. And my landlord said, well, what do you do? Why are you here? And I explained to him that I was interested in contemporary Turkish literature and that one of the people that I was considering to do research on was Aziz Nesin. He said, oh, Aziz Nesin. Yeah, he lives right down the road and he's a friend of mine. He said, would you like to meet him? And I said, well, of course. And so we walked about 6 blocks down the road to Aziz Bey's house, and he introduced me, and Aziz Bey was the most gracious person, and my decision was made. Of course, I was going to do an analysis of his writings, which were perfect for analysis because it was social and political satire, and he was a gifted writer and an incredibly prolific writer, and he was beloved by the reading public in Turkey, and he was well known throughout the Soviet socialist republics and in Iran and Egypt, and unfortunately he was not well known in the United States, of course, but he was a perfect. His writings were a perfect subject for analysis, and he was just so gracious. Just a wonderful person to get to know as a human being. Even though I know he was at the time, and he still is, a controversial figure for some of his political views. But if you got to know him as a person, even if you had, I saw him interact with people who differed strongly with his political views. He was very respectful, and always made his arguments based not on emotion, but as factually as he could, and he listened to them. One of the things that amazed me was, in Turkey at that time, as you know, there were literally maybe 20 daily newspapers published, and each one had a different point of view. And if you went to Aziz Bey's house, he had every one of them every day, and he skimmed them all. And I asked him about that once, and he said, well, here, the only way you know what's going on is you have to read all these different newspapers because they all have a different point of view. And if you want to be an intellectual leader in the country, you have to know not just what you believe, but what everybody else believes.
Yeah, he was remarkable. Anyway, is there any way we can get a copy of your thesis, or are you planning to publish it as a book, which would be very valuable for the American public and for the Turks too? I have read some of his books, the satire books, but then I didn't know he had plays. I was reading about it, and it was with Talat Halman. I think it was published in a collection of modern Turkish literature. So are you planning to publish it? I think you really should.
Well, I made an attempt to publish it, but the publishers all thought that the audience was too small for such a book to be publishable. Talat Halman's book, interestingly enough, Aziz Nesin's play in there, which is Chichu, I translated that for Talat Bey. So that one at least got published. I translated a couple of short stories for a different collection of Turkish literature that was published in English, and I did a couple of his short stories for that. But the problem with social and political satire, which is really his Aziz Nesin's strong point, is that it's socially and culturally bound, and it's very difficult to effectively translate political and social satire. And as they say in the comedic world, if you have to explain the joke, it's not funny. and to some extent with Aziz Nesin's humor, in order for people to understand why Turks think it's funny, I would have to explain it. Because you have to know, particularly in some cases, exactly what was going on at that moment, because he was so prolific that he would turn out a story based on what had happened in the newspapers that day. And everybody would immediately know why it was really funny. But if you didn't know what was going on that particular day and what was the sort of social or political topic of the day, you wouldn't understand why it was funny.
You have to know the background, and it's regional and local. That's true. But I still love his satire. Actually, he grew up in Heybeliada, where I'm from.
Oh, really?
And his father disappeared. And my grandfather was an imam of Heybeliada. And if he is considered the orphan, he could enter Darüşşafaka, which is an excellent school. So my grandfather wrote a letter that he's an orphan when he wasn't. My grandfather was lying, but that's okay. And he entered Darüşşafaka that way. But I think after a while, his father showed up, and he kind of didn't go to school. And there were other complications, but it's mentioned in his book with my grandfather's name and such. So I like him very much. I mean, I like him as an author, of course. So is there any way you can get hold of the thesis, though, at least? Are you being very modest, or you can publish that in Amazon as demand?
I know I could do that, and I considered it, and maybe I will.
Yeah, please do, because this is a hidden gem, I think, which we need to take a look. I mean, I don't know if anybody else did a close analysis of his work. I'm sure there are some, but Ph.D. thesis, so it must be pretty interesting. Anyway, so that's for another hour. So so let's get to, so after Turkey, you got interested in Near East, and you went to Michigan and got your degree. And then, when did you write the book? So were you interested in the Ottoman, your interest in Middle East, in Near East, was it present time, the past, all over? So how did that develop?
Well, at the university, when I lived in Turkey, one of the things that surprised me, actually, was that the Turks didn't talk a lot about this great 500 years of Ottoman history. People talked, of course, enthusiastically about the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 and about Suleiman the Magnificent. But other than that, they pretty much skipped the rest of the Ottoman Empire and went straight to the founding of the Turkish Republic and Ataturk as the hero. And that was perfectly understandable. Ataturk was, of course, an incredible hero. And the Turks were rightly proud of their war of independence. But for me personally, I was always surprised by that. And one of the things that I became infatuated with in graduate school when I was studying Ottoman history was the story of Mithat Pasha rather than of the sultans, because here was a man whose story was little known. Here was a man who potentially could have changed history and almost did, came very close to changing history. And if he had been successful, the story of the Ottoman Empire from 1876 to 1923 might have been quite different.
But I mean, it would have been a very miraculous change after so many years of monarchy or absolute monarchy to immediately change overnight practically. I mean, it took years plus a battle of independence to bring the urge to change. So in 1923. So tell us more about Mithat Pasha and how. What did you find about him mostly, and how did he come to be such a progressive statesman?
Well, Mithat Pasha came out of actually a line of reformers that had begun earlier in the 19th century in 1839, when what was called the Tanzimat first was propagated, and the Tanzimat was a reform movement that was intended to actually completely change how the Ottoman Empire was administered. And one of the key provisions of that was equal treatment for all people. As you know, in the Ottoman Empire, each so-called millet, each community, the Christian community, the Jewish community, and the Muslim community, they were all separately administered effectively by themselves, particularly in terms of their legal systems. And so there was always an accusation that in each community, particularly in the minority communities, the Christians would always complain that they weren't treated equally. Well, the whole focus of the Tanzimat reform was to treat everybody equally. But then guess what? The Christians decided, oh, wait a minute, we don't want to be treated equally. That would mean our sons would have to serve in the Ottoman army. And that would mean that we would have to have our disputes resolved in a Muslim court, and instead of by a Christian court. In addition to that, the Muslims also didn't want Christians to be equal, because they didn't want Christians in the military either. So on a theoretical level, the reformers, like Mithat Pasha, but his predecessors, Rashid Bey and Ali Bey, they had this concept, but the people were not ready for this concept. The Muslims didn't want the Christians to be equal. The Christians didn't want themselves to be equal. So this was, in theory, the Ottoman, the new Ottoman government. It was to be equal administration for all people. And that was on paper. It had been promulgated, but it was never implemented because nobody actually wanted it. So that's the development out of which Mithat Pasha came. He actually studied under the last of those previous reformers, and he was just taking it to a new level. What he saw was that if they actually had a constitution that required this, it would achieve two things. One, it would actually make real this change that existed in theory, because as part of his concept of a which he actually called a constitutional monarchy, he was modeling it after Great Britain. The Sultan would not be eliminated, but the Sultan would be a kind of figurehead, and the laws would be propagated by the parliament, and the parliament would be made up of Jews and Christians and Muslims. And in that way, it would be clear to everybody that, in fact, all citizens were equal, and that would give the three religious groups a venue in which they were working together, and therefore they would become more accustomed to working together as co-equals. In fact, under the very first reform in 1839 of the Tanzimat, one of the things that had been created were these multi-religious local councils. They had in effect the model of a parliament, but it was only on the local level. But that was, Midhat understood that that was the really important place where you start. Instead of from the top down, you start from the bottom up, and you get the local communities accustomed to being in a representative body where they made decisions about what was going to happen locally. And this concept was implemented very effectively by Midhat Pasha when he was appointed an administrator of a province. He had proven this to work very effectively. And it was one of the reasons that he was so widely respected, both within the Ottoman government and in Europe. He didn't just have an idea. He had implemented that idea, and he had proven that Christians, Jews, and Muslims could come together in these local decision-making bodies and agree on policies by which their communities would be administered.
If he would have succeeded, if Abdul Hamid would not have been so autocratic and reversed the improvements, do you think it would have worked?
Well, who knows? Based on what he succeeded in doing at the local level, one would hope it could have worked. But of course, with a little background here, what actually happened was that Abdul Hamid was unexpectedly made Sultan, and nobody had expected him to become Sultan. Even he had not expected it, but because Abdulaziz had become completely ineffective, and because his successor, Murad V, had turned out to be emotionally unstable, as a last resort, Midhat Pasha and the ministers, the Council of Ministers, finally brought in Abdul Hamid because he was sort of their last resort. Well, Abdul Hamid had not really prepared for this, so initially he felt obligated to go along with Midhat Pasha because he was so highly respected both within the Ottoman government and in Europe that he felt he didn't have any choice. So he Abdul Hamid, promulgated that constitution that in effect brought about a democracy, and he approved the convening of the first parliament, and the parliament was convened very quickly because they didn't have time, they felt, to do proper elections. So they simply asked the leaders, the local dignitaries of each unit to appoint somebody to the parliament. The reason they felt an urgency was that Russia was threatening to invade, and they needed to get Britain on their side, because if the Russians knew that the British were going to side with the Turks, then they wouldn't invade. And so Midhat Pasha was trying to push this stuff through so he could convince Britain that this was now a modern country. It had a parliament just like theirs. It had a figurehead as a monarch, and they could, they should support them and help them resist Russia's advances in the Balkans. The Russians at this particular time were trying to take over the Balkans because they wanted, as they still do, an alternative from the Bosphorus to get to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean and so on. And by taking over the Balkans, they thought they could do that, and they would have been able to do that. Anyway, the Brits at this point were not willing to go along, and the parliament was disbanded by Abdul Hamid because in its very first debates, many of these people were not educated. They were representative of the community, but they were not educated. And so they started immediately to question decisions made by Abdul Hamid, decisions made by the ministers, the war decisions made by the commanders. And Abdul Hamid listened to this and said, these people are ignorant, they don't know what they're doing, and he closed parliament. He did not, importantly, he did not abrogate the Constitution. He closed parliament because he didn't feel that it was being helpful. And he realized that at that particular point, the war had started, and he needed to be in charge. Somebody needed to be in charge, and it couldn't be a whole bunch of different voices in a parliament trying to decide whether or not the military strategy should be this versus that. And so he took it over, and he exiled Mithat because he didn't want to have an alternative voice that people could listen to.
Well, they were not used to. I mean, this absolute monarchy is very difficult to change. Now, British went to constitutional monarchy very nicely and smoothly, and it works very well. But they have a huge, many centuries of tradition of parliamentarian approach to events. But there was so much nationalistic feelings, movements happening around that time. He was just starting all over Europe. And of course, the minorities in Ottoman Empire were part of that. Plus, the Ottoman Empire was weak, and it would be good to encourage that while it gets weaker type of a thing. I mean, there were both approaches. So, but it is worrisome because even today, ethnic groups, it doesn't seem that they can live in peace in a mixed society. I mean, look at Cyprus. We have peace, and nobody died since 1974. Everything now it's probably going to be permanent, and there is peace there. So it's a great dilemma, though. It is. It's very difficult. Only U.S. can do it because U.S. is based on that. The whole concept of U.S. is immigrants from all over the world, and even that takes time. It is. So, but what you have written in the book was excellent because it really opened my eyes about Abdul Hamid. Abdul Hamid is always regarded in a very negative light. And as you say, in the first years of the Republic, we didn't want to think about the Ottoman Empire. We didn't want to think of the weak times. It was too traumatic for Turks to go through when the Ottoman Empire was coming down, one disaster after another. I think there was an approach that the government and the public message was just don't think about it. Just think of the first part and then the İstiklal Savaşı and move on. But now, of course, we are comfortable. Yes, we have ups and downs, but Turkey is considered a medium-sized power, apparently, which is good in spite of different thinking. So what did you really did bring a human side of him. And also he did a lot for Turkey. He did the infrastructure. Can you talk a little more about Abdul Hamid too?
Well, the genius of Abdul Hamid was that he was able to grasp what his situation was. And his situation was that they had just lost that in the very first year of his reign, first year and a half, they lost a disastrous war to Russia. And Russia was right at the gates of Istanbul, and Britain at the very last minute realized that if they didn't step in, Russia was very likely going to take over Istanbul. And if they went into Istanbul, they would never leave. They would be there today. And so at the very last minute, in spite of the fact that the Ottoman Empire was not very popular in Great Britain at that time, at the very last minute, they decided the last thing they needed was to have Russia in charge of the Ottoman Empire. And so they sent the British Navy into the Sea of Marmaris, and they anchored right outside Istanbul, and made it clear that whatever you do, you don't dare to step into Istanbul. And so the Russians backed down, and there was a convention in Berlin to renegotiate the terms of peace. And the genius, if you will, of Abdul Hamid may be more desperation than genius, but what he understood was that he was no longer feared by anybody militarily, and he could not hold on to any of these territories militarily. And as you pointed out, this was the beginning of nationalism, when people wanted to live exclusively with people who spoke their language and practiced their religion. And it didn't matter to them if it was only a small little piece of territory. They wanted it to be their territory with their language and their religion, even their sub-religion. I mean, for example, the Bulgarians definitely did not want even though they were Orthodox, they didn't want the Greek Orthodox to be there. They wanted Bulgarian Orthodoxy. And all of these places were very compartmentalized in that way. There wasn't much, I forget the term now. There wasn't much tolerance for other religions and other peoples anywhere. It was sort of the antithesis of the Ottoman concept. The Ottoman concept was not a Turkish concept. The word Turk was actually a pejorative term and meant farmer. The Ottomans thought of themselves as Ottomans, which was a very proud thing to be, because an Ottoman spoke Turkish, yes, but they also understood Arabic and Persian. They could quote from Persian poets. They were very proud of being internationalist in a sense, and very proud of being the home of all these different sects of Islam, different sects of Christianity, different sects of Judaism. They were all welcomed, and each had their own sort of contract, in effect, with the Ottomans as to how they would be a part of the empire. And as I said, the genius of Abdul Hamid was to see that in order to keep those various groups together, he had to give them even more autonomy. One of the geniuses of the Ottomans was that when they took over these territories, they primarily permitted local people to continue to administer these places, and their obligation to the Ottomans primarily was to provide tribute, to provide an annual tribute, to recognize the Sultan as the head of state, and in many cases to provide soldiers in times of war. And Abdul Hamid kind of upped the ante on that by really giving them almost complete autonomy, and all he cared was that they recognized him as the sovereign, and they paid him an annual tribute. And that was always negotiable, and sometimes people didn't pay it. And when they didn't pay it, he didn't send the army, because that would have been that would have just caused a crisis. So the tributes were pretty small, but it meant that on paper they remained a part of the empire, and that was a sort of genius.
Yeah, it is. It is very, and then of course, was it really married to the Belgian lady, or was it part of the fiction?
I'll get to that in just a minute. I just wanted to make one more point about this, understanding with these other territories. In some cases, these territories were actually under other foreign governments. For example, Egypt was controlled by France and England. And when he was negotiating, they sometimes tried to drag him into their local problems, and he wouldn't agree to it. He would just, so he succeeded sometimes just by being stubborn and just by saying no. And the Europeans and the Russians knew that the empire was very weak, but it survived partly because of this negotiation, but it also survived because the Europeans and the Russians knew that if they wanted to tear it apart, they would have to go to war with each other. And they wouldn't be at war with the Ottoman Empire, they would be at war with each other. And they feared each other, even if they didn't fear the Ottoman army anymore. Okay, so I wanted to make that point. Now, Flora Cordier, the Belgian woman. Well, as far as I could tell from the historical record, they officially got married, which was quite unusual. They got married before he became Sultan. About a year before that, he was a prince at the time. And they apparently lived that summer, just before he became Sultan, as a couple in love. I mean, all the historical record seems to suggest that this was a marriage of passion, and he had concubines before that, but he agreed to give them up. He continued to support them in a different house, but he didn't spend time with them because that was Flora's demand, and he gave her a Turkish name, which is actually, I think, Persian. He called her Nigyar. And they were quite happy, but she had told him at the time that they got married that if he did become Sultan, she would not go to the harem. And he didn't pay much attention to that at the time, because at that time he wasn't expected to become Sultan. But then when he became Sultan, she said, I'm not going to the harem. And at that point, power was more important than love, and he decided to go and live in the palace without Nigyar because he was about to become Sultan, and being Sultan obviously trumped being in love.
Yeah, well, this adds so much to the book, though. It is. So, I'm reading historical books, of course. Ottoman Empire history reads like a detective novel. It's always something happening, but the book is very excellent, mixing the personal issues with the big international questions.
I wanted to say one more thing about that. When I decided that to write the book, because I thought Midhat's story and Abdul Hamid's story also just needed to be more accessible to people, because it was well written up in histories, but people don't read histories. So I thought, well, I should write a historical novel. And then I was thinking, well, if you write a novel, there should be some love story. There should be some sex, right? So to my great amazement, I didn't have to make it up. It was there.
It was there. That's amazing. That's amazing, really. And another excellent part of the book is you describe the war, the Russian war. It should be really considered the First Balkan War instead of Russian war. It was really a huge upheaval there. And you described it so well. And then you really showed what Turks also have suffered. We always hear it's always the other side suffering more. And because it's the Christians who wrote the books. But now it was balanced, and suffering that went on at the upheaval in the Balkans was just unbelievable, and you described it very effectively. So what happened to the military that was supposed to be so good in the past centuries? Even as Mahmud II reformed the military, got rid of the Yenicheris, and what went wrong, you think, that
Well, the military commanders, the Turkish soldiers fought as they always had in every war with great valor. And they would have won the war if they had had any commanders who had come up with a reasonable strategy. The overall strategy was completely wrong. That strategy was to strictly be on the defense. They dug in their soldiers on the Balkan side of the Danube and waited for the Russians to come to them. And even when they won some of these local battles and the Russians were in retreat, they didn't pursue them. They allowed them to retreat and regroup and come back to them. There was no offensive plan whatsoever. There were people who advised Abdul Hamid, particularly Hobart Pasha, who was a Brit, who was in charge of the Navy. The Navy had, of course, been completely destroyed at the Battle of Navarino in 1827 as part of the Greek independence war. So in order to rebuild it, they had to buy the warships from Great Britain. They also had to get the British naval officers because the Ottoman Navy had depended entirely on Greeks. The officers were Greeks, the sailors were Greeks. So after Greek independence and after the war, after the Battle of Navarino, the Ottoman government had nothing left. So they had to train Turks to be sailors. They had to train Turks to be naval commanders. Anyway, one of the commanders who was still in charge, who was in charge of a major portion of the Navy that was stationed at the mouth of the Danube, was this guy, Hobart Pasha. And Hobart Pasha advised the Turkish commanders that before the Russians even invaded, he said, we need to have our warships in the Danube. We need to be waiting for them. We need to be able to shell them before they ever get to the Danube. But again, the commander said, no. They're never going to be able to cross the Danube. It's too big a river. And if they do, we'll trap them between where we are and the Danube, and they'll regret having crossed it. Well, that was a complete that was just a terrible strategy. And then even the tactics after the war began were all wrong. They were always on the defensive, assuming that the Russians weren't actually intent on going any further, that the Russians really weren't intent on going all the way to Istanbul. And surely if we just put up a little defense here, they'll give up and go home once it becomes winter. I mean, their attitude was, well, the Turkish soldiers, they'll withstand the winter, but the Russians, once it gets cold, they'll go home. Well, the Russians are kind of used to cold also. And
more so.
It was just a very bad strategy.
Yeah, it's very hard to read, but what tragedy. Well, in a sense, the constant conflict and bickering among the European powers really helped Turkey, because we're down the, award ready to be picked. What do they call it? A low-hanging fruit.
Yes, well, the important thing about that was that there was this debate. You know, of course, that the Ottoman Empire at this point was called the sick man of Europe. And the debate was, should we try to cause the empire to collapse? But the prevailing feeling was, no, we don't need to. It's going to collapse of itself. I mean, it is in such terrible shape. We don't have to do anything, because if we try to take an initiative, we'll be at war with each other. We can just sit and wait for it to collapse, and then we'll decide what to do.
Yes, it is, but it didn't go that way. It collapsed, but came back again. I'm reading A Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin, and it's so real. It is many things compared today too, it is very interesting. Well, let me ask you, we're running out of time. The book, the children's book, did you write it for your grandchildren? I mean, I've read the outline. I'm going to read it. I love those little mice. many who wanted to be like Zeus, and it was delightful. And I'm going to read the book. In fact, I'm going to get more copies to give to my friends' grandchildren. It is a delightful book.
The book is no longer for sale because the publisher went out of business, but I have many copies. Tell me how many you want. I will give them to you.
I'll come and pick them up and have a little chat over like I did the other day. And no, it is very good. So how did that come around?
Well, I always told stories to my children. And so when my daughter had 3 sons, when she was unfortunately never living right here. So on those rare occasions when I would get to see them, particularly when I went out to California where she was, as we would be driving various places, I would tell them stories. And I was going to the airport, and I started this one story about these mice. And we got to the airport, and I had just barely begun the story because in my mind it was getting to be a long story. So my grandson says, well, when are you going to finish the story? And I said, well, when I get home, I'll write the story and I'll send it to you, assuming that it would be about 30 pages. Well, the first draft was 600 pages. And I sent it actually to my oldest grandson at the time, who was reading quite well at that point. And he liked the 600-page version. And so I decided, well, if I cut it in half, maybe other people will also read it. So that's how it came about.
It is lovely. And so I know where to obtain it because I saw it in the write-up too. So what do you want to add something more on your experience as a Peace Corps volunteer and your excellent in-depth knowledge of late Ottoman history? Do you want to have something to add?
Well, I mean, my experience in Turkey, I would talk about a little bit. You know, it was overwhelming in a way to be off in this small town of Çankırı. And there were so many interesting things that happened. When you learn a foreign language, of course, some comedic things always happen. One of my favorite memories is over the word hemen versus hemen. I knew the word hemen, and I was taking a dolmuş from one little town to another, and when I got to the next town, I wanted to take one to the next town. And there was the minibus was there, and I asked the driver, when are you leaving? And he said, hemen. I said, well, hemen means immediately, hemen must be right now. But after about 40 minutes, I went back to him and I said, just exactly when are we going to leave? And he said, hemen. And at that point, I figured out that
it means opposite, actually. That means right now. Hemen,
So that was.
When were you last in Turkey?
The other funny language story I'll tell you is shortly after I had been there, not very long, maybe 3 months or something, and my Turkish wasn't so good. Where the teachers were always planning social events, and so that day in the teachers' lounge, they said, "We're going to see an American Western at the theater tonight." Now, and this movie theater was a brand new thing in Çankırı. It had just opened, and it got closed down shortly after this because the imam thought it wasn't good for people to go to movies. But he thought some of the movies weren't appropriate. But anyway, so we went. They said, "Well, this is going to be an American Western. It's a John Wayne movie. You must come." So I went to the John Wayne movie, and I'm sitting there waiting for it to start, and it starts. And John Wayne comes onto the screen, and he says, "Merhaba, nasılsınız?" It's like, what? I said, wow, how did they teach him Turkish? I had never been to a movie that was dubbed in another language. So anyway, John Wayne spoke Turkish throughout the movie. And the dialogue and the plot in an American Western isn't that complicated. So I understood what was going on. And that was a lot of fun. But that first moment when John Wayne burst onto the screen and said, "Merhaba, nasılsınız?" was quite amazing.
It is amazing, yeah. Yeah, you should write a book on your Peace Corps experience, like he did. You know, the one.
Right. Yes, I've read his book. It's
Big Bay all the time, and you really should. You're a good writer. You have the interest, and both books are excellent. So, anyway, thank you so much. We probably have enough material for a few more programs in future. And so we'll stay in touch and definitely we'll promote this. Now, this will be broadcast tomorrow at 1:30, and then it will be on a link, a YouTube link, and Facebook. And it's available at all times to send out or keep it for your archives. I don't know how long it stays. Perhaps you can copy and make it. I don't know. I don't know the technical part. Thank God we have good guys. And they're all doing it from Turkey. I mean, Bülent Bey is doing it from Turkey. There are sometimes others. And different cities in Turkey, not even the same city. Amazing. Thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch. And it was really fascinating. I love your jokes and the nice humor that goes with it. Thank you.
Thank you.